Good afternoon and welcome back to this final discussion on the poetry of Kamala Das, where my focus will be specifically on the poetic technique of Das. And I will try and argue that, much like Helen Sisu's idea of feminine écriture, Das is incorporating, for the first time in Indian writing in English, a distinctly female voice and a distinctly female way of writing. And I'll be looking at Das's poems through the prism of a theoretical concept called écriture féminine, or the writing of the feminine, as it were, the speaking voice of the woman. Now, before I move on to this, I would like to read to the last two poems of Kamala Das with you. So far, we have read a number of texts, right? We've read her autobiographical works, Afternoon in Malabar, My Grandmother's House, an Introduction, which were primarily directed towards the articulation of her positionality, her identity as a woman poet located across various spaces in India, her womanliness, as it were. We've also read yesterday a second group of poems which talks about the angst and the suffering of women, the voice of protest against the loss of life and love, the loss of opportunity, and this distinction between lust and life, the articulation of women's sexuality, but this perennial vacuum that seems to linger within her of not finding true love. What I'll do today is read two more poems with you, the final two poems, where thus we'll be talking about more her way of writing. So in these two poems, as it were, the texts will turn inwards towards an articulation of how her poetic craft operates and what words mean for her. So I'd like to share my screen with you at this point of time. And here you are with these two texts. The Maggots is the first poem that I'd like to discuss. And you see, at this point, what Das is doing is she's falling back upon the archetypal mythological paradigm of Radha and Krishna, where you see, very often, when the male poet talks about Radha and the way in which her inner desire for Krishna is manifested, it is Krishna to whom the poem really is directed, even though, they talk about the longing of Radha. So in a sense, within this myth of Radha and Krishna, it is the male Krishna who, with his phallogenic flute, the flute, remember, is the signifier of the male phallus, is the dominant structure around which Radha's feelings are, as it were, articulated and directed. So it's male desire that draws in the female. What Das will do is she will carefully reverse this order. And you see, also very interestingly, Radha Krishna, in the Radha Krishna myth, It's a challenge to the dominant patriarchal hierarchies, where, you see, the woman, the transgressive woman, is frowned upon. But central to the Radha Krishna myth is the fact that Radha is somebody else's woman, right? Therefore, her desire for Krishna exists on that fringe. It's sanctioned by religion in the sense that Krishna is a god, in the way that Mirabai sort of uh, longs for Krishna again, and Sham. And Sham therefore becomes, everybody's God beloved, as it were. But if you take it to the bare bones, then it is the desire of a woman for a man who is not the husband. So, thus is taking this Radha Krishna myth and reversing this by placing what is Radha's point of view within. So, no longer is this poem totally directed against Krishna, totally directed towards Krishna. The focus suddenly shifts on what Radha feels inwards, and a Radha who's actually had two men loving her, her husband as well as Krishna. So, in that sense, this sudden reversal of this pattern of the myth. And take a look at the poem, because this poem does not talk about the sweet sound of the flute, the cows roaming all around the pastoral Vrindavan. It rather talks about maggots. At sunset on the river bank, sorry, there's a typo there, Krishna loved her for the last time and left. So it is this, fulfilling, eternal love that has come for the last time, as it were, for her. It's a love that Kamala Das also sees as something which is, in that sense, sublime, which transgresses the merely physical and fills in the soul, something which she's yearned for in the autobiography, something that she's bared herself and said that I could not feel this vacuum. And then comes the moment when Radha sleeps in her husband's arms. That night in her husband's arms, Radha felt so dead that he asked, "What is wrong? Do you mind my kisses, love?" Right, so this is come back to the domestic, lustful, marital bed. And she said, "No, not at all, but thought." So the woman puts on a persona, a fulfillment in love, but in reality is never fulfilled. And said, "What is it to the corpse?" But thought, what is it to the corpse if the maggots nip? Now, therefore, you see, suddenly this concept of marital love is, as it were, reversed into the category of the bite of the maggot, of the worm on a corpse. So Radha is, as it were, at this point of time, a corpse which is unfeeling, which is insensitive towards the touch, because it's merely physical and it is a maggot's touch. So Krishna and the concept of this sublime love towards which Kamala Das yearns, or the poet yearns, as it were, the poet persona, the woman yearns, is a fulfilling, sublime love, compared to which, this touch of the husband, of the more mundane husband, of the more mundane daily domestic life, is like a maggot's nip. It's like a maggot's bite on a corpse. Now, it's very interesting, isn't it, that while we have had so much references to, the love between Radha and Krishna in so many collective works in our literature, This is a startling deconstructive image that looks at the woman's perspective through an image which is not allied with love at all. So it's in that sense that you see that Das is bringing in a poetic craft, a choice of word and metaphor that is startlingly new, and that is squarely putting in the voice of the woman at the center. What is this, therefore, the poetic technique that Das is looking at? I'll come to this in a moment. Let me read the last poem which I've chosen. Words. All around me are words and words and words. Remember that the poet is a wordsmith. And the poet is also part of a logocentric world. Speech and writing, logocentric. And language is ordered, rationalized. A language that is very dominantly male uses a certain grammar and a syntax and a rationality. Therefore, they grow on me like leaves. And Das suggests, Kamala Das suggests, that you see, it is this male logocentric voice that she seeks to challenge and find an idiom that will give voice to the woman's consciousness, as it were. Devise a language that will, and a poetic scheme, a poetic technique that will challenge the very ordered, cliched world of male desirous love poetry. So they grow on me like leaves. So you see, within the woman's heart, there is feeling that gnaws for expression. They seem to grow on me like leaves. They never seem to stop their slow growing from within. So, it is as it were the woman's body, the woman poet's body, is a fertile zone where different leaves sprout at different places. And these words, they seek expression to talk about themselves, their identities, problems, their sort of the male dominance over them. But I tell myself, Das writes, words are a nuisance. Very often women have been taught to remain silent, not speak, nor write. You will remember, of course, the story in our legends of Connor. You remember Connor, who was a philosopher who could see into the future. And because her prophecies often turned out to be true, Connor's tongue was cut off as a retribution. Compare this with, say, somebody like Nostradamus, the man whose prophecies are celebrated the world over. When the woman prophesied, the tongue was cut out. That's how language is structured phallocentrically. In that sense, it is the logocentrism and the phallocentrism. Both are in cahoots with each other, both operate together so that language becomes exclusively, literature becomes the province of the male, therefore expression, writing. And whenever the woman comes in, she is somewhere thwarted. I tell myself words are a nuisance. Beware of them. They can be so many things. A chasm where running feet must pause, to look a sea with paralyzing waves, a blast of burning air, or a knife more willing to cut your best friend's throat. So, words can give expression to your red hot rage. It can be a moment to pause and think, a chasm where running feet must pause, a sea with paralyzing waves, a moment when the words swell up within you, when you have a combination of extreme unwillingness, reticence, as it were, or something which you want to say which will be deliberately hurtful. But words are complex things. Words are a nuisance, but they grow on me like leaves on a tree. So Kamala Das is trying to come back to this idea of the romantic poet who expresses, who is under the urge of her imagination, of her consciousness, to express her feeling only because she's a woman. These voices are stifled within her, and they seek expression through all kinds of forms and languages. See, her writing in two languages, words seek to grow on every tree that she has. They never seem to stop their coming from a silence somewhere deep within. Now, if it was a man, we could have easily talked about the romantic imagination, Coleridge's idea of, this sacred river Alf and its expression through the poet's imagination. Wordsworth would talk about the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling aided by solitude. But Kamala Das suggests that for a woman, these words grow within her, voices of protest, of grief, of unfulfillment, of fulfillment in love. And they seek expression. But not at every moment can the woman express herself. Therefore, this process through which the woman seeks to articulate herself, and the way in which she articulates herself, is what Das is looking at. You remember the table, the dining table that I talked about in her autobiography, where she says she would sit chopping the vegetables in the morning and the afternoon. It was only at nights when the entire family had gone to bed that same dining table then became her writing table. So the words which were gnawing inside could find expression only after she had fulfilled her roles as a woman. So, these chasms that she has to cross, these different levels of difficulties that she has to undergo. And let me here bring you to one more screen of mine. And this is where I come to the concept of the écriture féminine. And this, I think many of you, especially my English honors students, should look at very carefully, as also the GEC students, because many of you will be girls, young women who express yourselves, who do not express yourselves, cannot express yourselves, and who seek to contain these words like trees within. So how does a woman express herself? And this is beyond, language. I'm talking in Bengali about, say, writers like Ashapurna Devi or Maheshwata Devi. How do they express themselves? Do they use a differentiated language than men do? That is what is articulated by a very well-known French feminist critique called Helen Cixous. Note the spelling Cixous. There are certain, stresses on Helen, but it is primarily sort of pronounced as Helen Cixous. And this is from a 1975 essay called The Laugh of Medusa. If you think you want to read this essay, I do have a copy of this essay. Here it is, The Laugh of the Medusa. If you want, I'll mail it to you. Those of you who want to read this after this class are very welcome to ask for it. What does Sisu say? Sisu suggests that male language, the male use of language, is very linear. So this happens after this, due to this, due to this. And women, therefore, when they write, seek a different order of language. The male order of language, Sisu suggests, is a symbolic order. The women, they have a language of their own, of a semiotic order, as it were, in the sense that, Sisu suggests that this is the language which takes place between the mother and the woman and the girl child before they encounter the father figure, right? So Sisu suggests that language, very often, the order of language that we have is very male-centric, and language therefore becomes an agent of patriarchy. So the female writer is seen as suffering the handicap, which is of using a medium, prose writing. This is very interesting again. You see, because when Kamala Das is writing the prose, she's writing in a language which is closer to her society, which is therefore more patriarchal in that sense. And yet when she's writing poetry, when she's being very intimate with us, she is using English as a language to, as it were, break through the patriarchal modes. So English as a language seems to be more liberal to her. So she takes up the English language as a kind of breaking through the patriarchal order, as it were. So this gives us a clue into that question as to whether, why rather Kamala Das uses the English language for her intimate poetry. Écriture féminine therefore uses a variety of metaphors, including milk, orgasm, honey, and the ocean. It is a disruptive and a deconstructive force. I will, come by to it, and I'll read a few poems by Kamala Das to show how this écriture féminine is done. But it is disruptive and deconstructive, talks about metaphors like milk, orgasm, honey, ocean, maggots here, disrupting the phallogocentric symbolic order and allowing more play in gender, writing, and sexuality. So Sisu is challenging women to write themselves out of the world men constructed for women. So writing then becomes a political act of breaking free from patriarchy and asserting one's own subjectivity. And therefore, this entire discourse pattern of writing is then directed towards their eroticization, sudden turn-ons, trips, crossings, trudges, abrupt and gradual awakenings, discoveries of a zone at once more timorous and soon to be forthright. So, subjects hitherto denied to women in poetry, journeys, incursions, touching upon erotic themes. And therefore, it is transgressive, rule transcendenting, intoxicated. It's clear that the notion is problematic. This is what Sisu suggests. Now let me come to another major feminist critic, Luce Irigaray, once again a noted French critic. Irigaray suggests that women's physical pleasure, what she calls pleasure in French, would be called jouissance. You find the word here, jouissance. So women's physical pleasure cannot be expressed by the dominant logical masculine language. And therefore, it's this erogenous, playful pleasure that must be expressed through a different language. And therefore, she's calling for a new order of women's writing, which she calls parler femme, woman speak. And this is more use of words in more creative ways, breaking the syntactical structures and the poetic rhythms. And therefore, Irigaray draws a direct sort of link between women's sexual expression and women's artistic expression. And she suggests that a woman's jouissance, a woman's writing, is more multifaceted because, as Irigaray suggests, women are far more, sexually feeling and sensitive in different ways. And therefore, her language goes off in all directions. And therefore, this multifacetedness, this multiplicity of perspectives that the woman offers in language. Now, Irigaray and Sisu both suggest that it's not about men and women, but also about gender, really. So a man who feels like a woman can equally access language in the way a woman necessarily would. And then both of them, Irigaray and Sisu, talk about how language has been denied to women and how they have been prevented from expressing their sexuality for themselves. So both of them are arguing that feminine écriture, or the woman's writing herself, does not follow the traditional male patterns. And therefore, continuously, even within the forms in which they write, they bring in a sense of urgency, physicality, and challenge. Now, having made that point, that's a theoretical point then that I have made about écriture féminine. I'll now try and read them through Kamala Das's poetry. Right. Now, you see, Kamala Das uses the lyric. But have you noticed something? These lyrics seem to be breathless, in the sense of the urgency that is put within the lyric. And at the center of that lyric, Kamala Das situates the very erotic, sensitive, feminine eye, the subjective eye of the woman's consciousness. And then you see how these lines keep on waxing and waning. Days of the week or names of the months, beginning with Nehru. I'm Indian, very brown, born in Malabar. I speak 3 languages, write 2, dream in 1. Don't write in English. They said English is not your mother tongue. So, it's as it were, the musicality of the lyric is as it were being continuously disrupted by the speaking voice of the woman, which is seeking to wrest her subjectivity. Right? Why not let me? And then, you see, What Kamala thus does also is put forward a lot of questions. See the interrogative tone within her poetry. Interrogation and satire, they go together. So why not let me speak in any language I like? And then comes these words which Kamala Das uses: maggots, distortions, queernesses, and then this urgent, you know, pull towards herself, mine also. So this vigorous and almost intense attempt to grasp language in all its awkwardness towards herself is part of the poetic technique through which Das's écriture féminine works. And then, you know, if you go back once again, you see the interrogative pattern here. It voices my joys, my longings, my hopes. You see how the run-on lines, keep on seeking, keep on gathering, keep on trying to sort of devour experience and express herself, as it were. And then there is this continuous reference to the body, right? I became tall, my limbs swelled, and one or two places sprouted hair. Once again, the fundamental female body is time and again foregrounded, time and again brought before us, as it were. The body in all its hairy, leaky shapes and body fluids is grafted before us, not as something which is, couched in very romantic, as it were, dresses, but the basic naked female body with its sexualities and its body hair. And then, of course, once again, the reference to the man. And you see, in thus this language of protest and this mode of expression is not very violent. You see, even if the men are violent, the woman, as it were, speaks always in an understatement, right? Where, the man's violence is taken for granted, and then the woman moves on, right? And the ways in which, language also seeks to create boundaries around her. Dress in saris, be girl, be wife, they said. You see immediately how the language becomes prescriptive in the way patriarchy prescribes certain boundaries. Fit in. See that very short sentence structure, fit in. And then, once again, you see the language of her own expression swells up. And if you notice here and later on, you see these spaces between the lines, these three dots, silences, where there's more unspoken, where the woman seems to try and find the language, but language fails her, right? So it's in the sense that these are poems where the woman is seeking to grasp language, and language is failing her. Just as I am every woman who seeks love in me, what is there in me? And it is here that the phallocentric language fails her. And then she has to pause and express herself in terms of, if you remember, the ocean movement, the ocean's tireless waiting. It is I who drink lonely drinks, the sinner and the saint, the Janus-faced woman, one part of whom patriarchy pulls towards itself to fashion her as they want her to be, and part who seeks independence. So, this struggle within the poet, the struggle within the female poet, and this poetic technique, the, the kind of pressure that she puts on the lyric, the periods when language seems to fail her, the metaphors that she uses, all are part of this poetic technique of feminine écriture. And once again, you see these gaps, right? So, once again, memory, the running wildness, flow, the hills, the mystery associated with the female self. And then there is, once again, the grandmother's house, where once I received love. And there's a very poignant silence there, if you see those three dots once again, because that unadulterated, unqualified love, that is the love between the women prior to the man's world encroaching upon her. That is what, you know, Helen Sissou would refer to as the pre-Oedipal state, where the woman, the child knows the mother and nobody else, and the word of the father does not come in. And then comes this idea of the wild despair, the frozen air, and the comparison of the two states. One was proud and loved, and then again the poignant silence and the ruthless critique of what the man has made of her, a dog who waits patiently. Now, if you look at this poem, Freaks, for example, in terms of poetic technique, you will see how the poem begins with the he, and how this he becomes presented in terms of the grotesque, sun-stained cheek, dark cavern, uneven teeth gleam, hands on my knee, a kind of a predatory, beastly, grotesque, monstrous sense of the man, eyes idly over puddles of desire. And then once again you have these three dots, these pauses, very pregnant pauses within Das's poetry, where the thought, the protesting thought comes through, and the woman expresses herself. And this desire for something more than the skin's lazy hungers. And then again, you go back to this subconscious of the woman, the lazy, coiling snakes of silence. If you're interested, you can also take a look at D.H. Lawrence's poem titled The Snake, how the snake slithering into its own burrows is almost, offering us a glimpse of the deep, mysterious world of the woman, which now must be expressed. And therefore, once again, this dichotomy of the freak. And Kamala Das uses this dichotomy, the saint and the sinner, trying to evade patriarchy while being pulled by it. Once again, when she exhibits lust, she's falling into the pattern of the slut or the fallen woman of patriarchy. Yet, in her poetry, she knows she's seeking a greater love and therefore trying to escape patriarchy, as it were. And once again, notice in this particular text, the looking glass, for example, is the woman's view of the male body, once again, dropping the towel and the jerky way he urinates. And then there's this loss of love, this vacuum, and this vacuum that never really can be filled. This desire for a love that is beyond the physical and the world, as it were, which is not comprehensible by the male, because the man's world is far more logocentric in that sense. And therefore comes this image. As we found in the maggot, we find the old playhouse. And you see, once again, if we had these images of the ocean, now comes the image of flight, this desire for flight, the urge to fly, and the endless pathways of the sky. And then comes the realization that the lesson that the man can give is only about himself, and the woman becoming the dwarf. And then this is a very strong and powerful poem which indicts the man and the way in which he crushes the woman's subjectivity totally within himself. But then comes the Stone Age, where the man can be classified as the fond husband, fat spider, weaving webs of bewilderment. So it's interesting in the way with which Das sees the marital relationship as a kind of a web woven by a spider or the bite of the maggot, and the way in which these run-on lines sort of keep up the distinct battering of the woman's personality, as it were. And therefore, let me come back to that last poem again. In the way that feminine écriture, in the way the woman accumulates words around her, words about her body, words about her perception of the world, words about the oppression that she faces in patriarchy, words that she expresses. Words are a nuisance. Beware of them. They can be so many things. A chasm where running feet may pause. So every poem is like a chasm which questions the woman's desire to be loved and the failure to attain that love. A sea with paralyzing waves, the waves of inner feeling and turmoil that the woman must necessarily search for in words and never find. And once again, you see this pregnant pause where Das is, as it were, grappling with a expressive idiom that can convey the depths of her passion, her sense of non-fulfillment, her angst, her agony, as it were. Words are a nuisance, she writes, but they grow on me like leaves on a tree. They seem never to stop their coming from a silence somewhere deep within. So it's this deep, fathomless ocean of the woman's consciousness, which Kamala Das plumbs and which she seeks to express through major, through certain standard formats of the lyric. But she brings an urgency into the lyric. She brings a breathless run-on line within the lyric which articulates the woman's questions, the woman's passions, the woman's unanswered questions, marked by pregnant pauses once again, where one must stop and question language, where the woman's expression is, as it were, faltering because she cannot express the depths of what she feels. And the failure of language at another level to, really provide her the voice through which her passions might be known, through which her agony might be known. Therefore, when we started off this course, we came across a couple of questions. Many of you would probably see Kamala Das as a sensational poet who is famous because she's written about women's desires. But no, Das remains a a very powerful voice in Indian poetry in English. Not because she's just written about, you know, women's sexual feelings, but she's taken an entire gamut of longings and desires, unfulfillments, agony of the woman poet, and sought to articulate it in a new idiom of poetry, where she pushes the lyric to its limit through its pauses, run on lines, metaphors, so that this poetry becomes a language, a questioning of the status of woman, a protest against the oppressions against her, and also suggests that a new order of language should exist which can give vent to how a woman can express herself. It is here, I think, that Kamala Das's achievement as a poet lies. Her poems are questions about identity of the Indian writer in English, the Indian woman writer in English. They are poems about the condition of women in India. They are equally political poems which seek to provide empowerment to the woman through the process of writing. But they are also simultaneously very well crafted poems that seek to bring out a form and a language through which the woman's innermost feelings, desires, sexualities, the multiplicities that go on into making the woman can be received. And this is where I'd like to come back to that question about intertextuality, as it were. Now, when Das is writing this, she has, as it were, a wealth of intertextual references in front of her. See, what Eliot at point of time talked about tradition and the individual talent is an essay that I would like you also to read at this point of time. Eliot suggests that the poet does not go without anything in front of him. He has a formidable body of writing. And he, with his individual talent, he contributes to alter, to challenging something within that body of tradition, through which he carves out his own space, his or her own space. How has Das done that? Das, on a one level, has used one of the most textualized of Indian literary tropes, the Radha Krishna myth. But in doing so, he has shifted the focus from the male perspective of Radha to a very interior perspective of Radha, where the husband's touch is the maggot's bite. Kamala Das, of course, uses the lyric, the love lyric, the Elizabethan love sonnet, the romantic love lyric of both Malayalam poetry and English poetry. But she injects into it the speaking voice of the woman with her consciousness, the ruptures, the pregnant pauses, the protests, the run on lines, the forceful rhetoric and syntax that goes through, the images of the ocean, the chasms, and therefore brings in a degree through which, there are always intertextual moments where forms, languages, myths are continuously being interrogated in her poetry. So it is in the sense that, we should not dismiss Kamala Das as somebody who writes from the heart and who is only talking about her desires. No, these are very carefully crafted poems. They use a lot of literature that has gone ahead, challenges them, injects the voice of the woman, talks about the multiplicity of the woman's subject position, and talks about, very critically, her desires, her subjugation, and her attempt to devise a language of her own. I guess it is in this degrees of complexity, in articulating the voices that seem to bubble up within the female poet. And it is in this unique and path breaking expression that Kamala Das gives to the Indian English poet. At a time when Indian society was extremely reclusive and patriarchal, that thus becomes one of the founding figures for an Indian writing in English by women as such. It is extremely interesting to see why she chooses the English language. Probably in the sense that she can, through the English language, thereby use it as a political tool to challenge the patriarchal form. Kamala Das does not use any regular meter in her poems to answer one of the questions. No, not every poem is intertextual in that sense of the term, but when they refer to some earlier myth, earlier poems of hers, images that she uses which have literary echoes, that these poems become intertextual as such. So it is with this then, therefore, with this, pointer towards her complexities in poetry, that I'd like to suggest that you read Kamala Das as a consummate craftsman who is weaving into her poetry a significant degree of complexity, and for the first time talking about women's empowerment through the act of writing. I have tried to see, how Das's poetry almost anticipates some of the theorizations of French feminism. Of course, there are other poets who went before her, Sylvia Plath, for example, Emily Dickinson, for example, but they were all within the Western canon. Within the canon of Indian writing in English, it is Das who therefore sees writing as explicitly a tool for the empowerment of women. Right. It is with that, therefore, that I would like to end this discussion today. But as Shominon has kept on asking questions, Shominon and I have tried to answer some of your questions through the course of the lecture itself. Well, Aditi, for example, asks why I am using this concept that women are not logical. No, this is not my concept at all. This is what Freud suggests. And it is with reference to Freudian psychoanalysis that both Helen Sissou and Luce Irigaray are responding. Therefore, it's a way in which women approximate reason in a much more complex way that Irigaray and Helen Sissou are responding. Logocentrism, of course, Aditi, is in the sense where we prioritize speech more than any other form of communication, be it spoken or the written word. And the written word has very often been the perspective of the man, right? If you take a look at the lyric, for example, if you take a look at the ways in which love poetry have been written, for example, apart from Sappho in the classical age, almost all the major poets have been men. And therefore, the woman has been framed very deliberately. You know, the, the woman has been framed very deliberately through the perspective of the man, right? Therefore, the attention to a particular kind of a body, a particular kind of a love making, a particular posture of love making, where the woman has always been as a receptacle rather than an initiator. So, when Das is questioning this, she is questioning this emphasis on the logocentrism, and she's using, therefore, a different order of language that prioritizes touching, feeling, deeper expressions. The order that you are referring to, Aditi, and I have referred to, of course, is also comes from Lacan, the French critic, who suggests that very often, the unconscious is, our unconsciouses are very often structured like language, and that the main structure of language is therefore part of the symbolic order. In response to that, Sisu suggests that the bond between the mother and the child, before the father's language order, symbolic order comes through, is an order of semiotics, of signs, as it were, of touching, of feeling, of the breast, of milk, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, you will understand that these are concepts for which you will need to read the essay in its original form, right? So for those of you who are interested, I'll send you this essay in both groups, in both the English honors group, as it were, as well as in the GC group, in case any of you would like to go take this forward in your language or literature studies as well, right? Because I can see that there are a lot of students from various groups. Now, Helen Sisu is also a very interesting philosopher in terms of philosophy, of sociology. So if students are interested there, you can always read the essay in greater detail. And then maybe when you've done that, we can once again reconvene to take your questions on this subject. As of now, let me bring this discussion to a close. Thank you for your questions. It's been a pleasure to interact with the GC group. I will provide you further instructions later on. And with my honors students, I am sure that these concepts that we have introduced today will be subjects of our discussion in further texts to come. As of now, then, I'll sign off today, and thank you for your patience and your attention.